Hello again and welcome to the chapter about the blockade. This is a fundamental concept within chess strategy. I actually had a thorough look at it in my other course, Mastering Chess Strategy. While here, I'm intending to look at it from a more defensive perspective when our king is in danger. What is the blockade about? Well, basically, we're speaking about putting one of our pieces in front of an enemy pawn so that that pawn can't move, and in its turn, that pawn, you can imagine there is a bishop behind it, perhaps a rook or a queen, so that an enemy pawn will also restrict their other pieces so that they also won't have too much activity, you could say. And at the same time, we should also notice that the piece which is taking up the blockading task, a knight, for example, it's usually very strong itself because it's placed in front of a pawn, so it can't easily be attacked. Please notice that we need a protected square for this idea to work out properly, because else obviously the blockading piece could be attacked by one of the opponent's pawns. Usually, I would say the best piece for the blockade is the knight, but other pieces can also take up this task. And finally, we also have a few other situations where we can use our pawns to blockade the opponent's pawns, so to speak, some kind of blocking situation, which can also be very helpful for defensive means. So we will have a look at these two situations, you could say, using a piece to carry out the blockade. And in the last part of this chapter, we will also check some examples where it's the pawns who are carrying out this idea of blocking the opponent's pawns and thereby restricting their play. So let's get started. Let's have a look at a first, you could say, quite basic example, but very useful in a typical Sicilian structure. So in this game, with white pieces, Ilyushinok, and playing black is Chigayev, you can see that those of you who play the Sicilian with white or with black, you will recognize this kind of position. You will see that it's probably from the Sicilian Scheveningen, where black puts two pawns on e6 and d6. At some point, white plays f4, black has played e5. There was a trade of these two pawns, and that's why we have this pawn structure, where you can see that white has more space. They're playing for an attack. They have this well-placed bishop in the middle, while also you could say they have a weakness on e5. This is like a stronghold for black. And also you could see the pawn on e4 is a bit weak in the long run. So what white is usually trying to do here, I'm convinced that you see that as well. Aha, exactly. The queen is not on e1 by coincidence. The queen is going to g3. After that, they would like to bring the rook to f1. They would have all the pieces in the attack. It would be a bit dangerous for black, this situation. So what black did here in this game, they carried out a typical idea, which consists in blocking the pawn on e4. So this pawn would like to advance at some point. It would help white's pieces. You could imagine if the bishop was on d3, for example, it would be very interesting for white to play e5. I remember some game by, I think, Judith Polgar, where she carried out this idea. Polgar, Hulak, I think it is. Fantastic game by Judith Polgar, with the two bishops lined up against black's king. e5 was played in that game, and white had a very nice attack. So what black did here, they simply prevented this by means of a knight maneuver, which helps to block the pawn on e4 confidently. Of course, you have a long time ago seen the right move here, definitely. That's what they played here in the game. Knight d7, the knight is coming to e5 no matter how white reacts. In this game, white continued with queen g3, black played knight e5, and after rook a f1. Actually, white has no concrete threat here. You can see that if knight d5, black will always take it, of course, and after that, both white's bishop, it's a bishop pair, but it's not that powerful. And okay, there are also some tactical issues like the pawn hanging on c2 and so on. So basically, black is happy here. What Chigayev played here was to move h6. Usually, we shouldn't move our pawns too much in front of the king, but he has seen that this move is helpful for installing the idea of bishop g5. White can, of course, prevent this by means of h4, but in that case, there are some tactics coming up here. Black would like to play, at some occasion, knight g6, but first they could play something like queen d8 to give this idea some more strength. And as you can see now, knight g6 is definitely in the air, and if white moves the pawn, obviously, they hand over the square on g5 to us. So that wouldn't be useful for them. So in the game, white played here bishop d3. This means that knight e5 is probably on the menu, because now they are protecting the pawn on c2. Black played and moved bishop g5. You remember the chapter about obstruction. This is a little connected to that. We are blocking the queen on g3. After rook 4f2, black played the move queen d8. Simple and strong. You can see now there is also the tactical idea of bishop h4. So white, basically they're in a dead end here. They can't really progress in their attack. In the game they took this pawn on e5, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes. Well, Sicilian players are used to giving away a pawn in such situations to get the better pawn structure in the long run. Here what black played in the game was rook e8. A very solid move. They had no problems to keep the balance here, even if they were a pawn down. But even stronger would have been a bishop move. So which bishop move do you think would be the strongest for black here? Sorry. Aha, you're right that we should not play bishop f6. This would give white a golden opportunity to change the nature of the position. We're talking here a little like revolution. We will come to this in a later chapter. White will definitely not think twice about rook takes f6. This means that we have a completely different position after pawn takes, rook takes. You can see that it's not that black is getting mated perhaps, but white has a lot of activity now. The pawn is hanging on h6, and also there are these like queen f4, e5, and bring in the knight and so on. So this would definitely not be in black's favor. What they should play here instead after the move queen takes e5 is bishop e3. This is much smarter because they do want to reach this diagonal with the bishop, but they will go this way instead. So what will happen here? Well, after rook f3, bishop d4, queen g3, black could actually give up the bishop pair if they like to create some weaknesses in white's camp. So queen takes, bishop takes c3. I think this makes sense here, even if it was possible to play in other ways. B takes c3 and queen g5. This is a nice move because what black is doing here, they're trying to trade queens. They know that the endgame will be very good for them. And if white don't trade the queens well, we could then perhaps use this blockading square for the queen, if you see what I mean. If white plays something like queen e1, protecting the pawn, we could play here queen e5. As you can see, another piece takes up the blockading task. But in this case, it's important to understand that there are no pieces which can really kick away the queen. White, they don't have, let's say, a bishop which could go to d4, or a knight could, at some point, could go to f3. So for the queen to take up this task, obviously, we have to see first which pieces are left on the board. The queen and the rook, I would say it's the same thing. They are not the typical blockaders for this simple reason that they have a higher value. So this would be very nice for black. Of course, white could trade queens also, but then even if we're a pawn down for this very moment, you can see that we will very soon get it back. Like bringing in the rook, we can take the pawn, or maybe we can first double the rooks and so on. One last thing here to notice also, that there is like an unblocking move which the other side can use. So we had that here actually. If we go back a few moves, instead of playing queen g5, maybe you asked yourself, then what happens if we just take the pawn, if we play rook takes e3? So we could do that, but the problem would be here, the dark side would be that white can play this move e5. So this is very important because this is the pawn that we were about to blockade, that we blocked in several variations here. But if this pawn is able to move forwards, that would be like the unblocking move. This is something which would change the battle completely. And I remember in Mastering Chess Strategy, there was a very nice example. I think it was Mikhail Tal with the white pieces against Gligoric, who carried out this idea, the unblocking advance, you could call it. So that's something to keep in mind. Even at the cost of a pawn, you could do this. The side which is faced with the blockade, they could try to unblock the blocked pawn, so to speak. All right, so simple example. I think we got a general picture here. It's nice to block this pawn by means of knight d7. This knight will come to e5, and the first merit of this plan is simply that white's bishop on d4 will be a bit obstructed, a bit limited, thanks to this knight on e5. All right, let's have a look at an example which takes place in a different structure, in a Caro-Kann structure. We have here with the white pieces Kusagra, and playing black is Manuel Petrosyan. So what you can see here, white has played g4 recently. Typical idea in the Caro-Kann, the classical variation with bishop f5 and, knight g3, bishop g6, and the bishops are traded and the kings are on opposite flanks, as you can see. So both sides, at least white is playing for an attack here. You can see g4 is intended to go g5. Sometimes you can take this pawn, but I would usually not advise to do it. Rook dg1 could be played here. You have to play f5, queen takes e6, king h8. I think the computer was saying that this was okay for black, but Yeah, not really my cup of tea. If I can avoid this, much better. And that's what happened in the game. Black played in the game a move which prevents g5. How do you think they could do that? And perhaps also thinking about the blockade in the future. That's right. Black played here knight h7. Clever move in Petrosian fashion, you could say. Actually, this is also Petrosian, but I was referring to the former world champion who was very good with this topic of the blockade. So knight h7. Now, as you can see, suddenly white can't really make g5 work. In the game, they played rook hg1. At some point, they would like to do this, but right now, as you can see, black has the same number of pieces controlling g5 as white has trying to control it with g5, so black is okay here. Speaking of a blockade, by the way, you can also see that the rook on d5, it's actually a blockading piece right now. Since c5, b5 were included, it's not easy for white to unblock, you could say, the d pawn. It's very difficult. It's one of the basic ideas in the Caro-Kann to get hold of this very nice stronghold on d5. Well, bishop f6 was played in the game. There is no hurry to play knight g5. First we play bishop f6, we put some pressure on d4, and also we avoid, or at least we don't worry so much about knight e5. Had we played, I think I looked at this also, had we played knight e5 trying to block, white could actually play knight e5, and you can see that f5 might come up next. This might be worrisome. Did I look at something here? Yeah, rook takes d4, bishop takes e5. You have another, you could say, revolution here coming up. Rook takes, white lost a pawn, but you can see that now, after rook d7, they have very nice compensation. So this is probably something that we should avoid with black. Bishop f6 was played in the game. Queen e4, protecting the pawn on d4, centralizing the queen. And here Petrosian played knight g5. So you can see that after knight takes d5, this time there is no chance for knight e5. The queen is in the air. Knight takes. You could take both ways, but if you take with the bishop, well, it's not a confident blockade. We talked about this when the square is not protected, then the blockade is not as safe. Here white will play f6 and play g5 as soon as possible. We should avoid this. So they took in the game with the pawn instead, the h pawn, I was going to say. And this is the other situation that we will see more of in the end of this chapter, when we can arrange our pawns in a way which block the opponent's pawns. Bishop e3, rook ft8, rook d2. As you can see, white is simply going to play rook d1 and try to defend their pawn on d4, which is a problem in the long run for them. Black played here queen a5, adding some tactics here to the situation. You can see that maybe the queen can go to b4, rook gd1. There was actually another idea behind queen a5. I'm sure you can see it. Black to play and win a pawn. Aha, that's a good method. Sometimes you see it in IQP positions also. It's typical in the isolated queen's pawn positions. e5, that's what black played here. As you can see, pawn takes, rook takes d2, wins material for black, else they can also take here. So safe to say it's black who is having an advantage here. So important method, knight h7 here. You could say a little about restriction also. We prevent g5, and later on we try to put this knight on g5, and if they take back, we will take with the pawn, and in this way we keep the kingside safely blocked. They are unable to open up the game with g5 as they were hoping for. In our next example, we will see a similar idea taking place on the queen side, and it's white who will use a blockading idea. In this game between Vallejo with white and Warmerdam playing with the black pieces, you can see that black has just played b4. Where do you think that knight should go? I would say in most cases, if you're able to do it, you should put this knight on a4. It's of course possible to go the other way, but in that case, black gets attacking chances. So Paco Vallejo played here knight a4. This is very clever because this knight will hold up black's attack for a while. The interesting thing is that white will actually accept doubled pawns for this sake of blocking the queen side. Very interesting. Yeah, we will see this very soon. If knight c5 was played in the game, black is immediately challenging this blockade. And if you not take, you can see that black takes back and the position changes a little. Since there is an open file, the d file, it's less likely for white to succeed in an attack. And black gets some extra chances like planting a knight on d4. So what white does in the game, he just ignores this move, knight c5. I think it's a very interesting example. He played here knight h5. He starts his own attack on the king side. As you can see, if black takes, there is a concrete problem. White could take like this. Bishop takes d7, bring the queen to h6, and it's already very unpleasant for black's king, the situation with knight f6 perhaps, or bishop f6 coming next. So after knight h5, black first play here e5, and after white's next move, bishop c4, you can see that there was a very deep idea that Vallejo used in this game. He has seen that black can take on a4, we take back, and later on we can put the bishop on b3. Fantastic blockade. It's almost impossible for black to enter. You can also see that it's nice that the bishop is taking control of the light squares after black's move e5. So black played here knight a5. Of course, you know the next move here, bishop b3, keeping everything closed. Black played rook c8, and at this point white notices that the knight on h5, it's basically not doing so much anymore because we don't have pressure against g7, so he redirects it to a nicer square. Aha, you got it. Now the knight would like to go to f5, and you can also see that if black tries to prevent this, what do you think white will play? Exactly. We will play here h4, try to play h5 in the next move and open up the game. This would be extremely dangerous for black. So after knight c3, black playing in the game queen c7, and now we continue with the plan knight f5. We're also targeting the pawn on d6, and actually the pawn on b4 was also hanging, but I think that he didn't like to take that pawn because he saw that maybe there was something with d5 and some counterplay and so on against the center. So I think it was smarter what he played in the game. He plays it safe with knight f5, rook ft8, and here simply white takes that pawn. Now we can take it because there isn't the issue with the d5 move. So he takes first on e7. I guess if you take first on b4, black would maybe play bishop f8 and try to get this move in anyway. So he first takes on e7, very technical play by Vallejo, queen takes, and now queen takes b4. So it's basically an extra pawn that white got here, not a trace of an attack for black. They played queen c7, and here simply rook d2, getting ready to play rook hd1, and at the same time protecting this pawn just in case, some kind of prophylactic thinking if we're back in the previous chapter. So basically, interesting example of what white is doing here. They are trying to block black's attack on the king side, on the queen side. They play for that reason knight a4, and they don't shy away from actually doubling their a-pawns in this sense, because they know that they can later on bring in the bishop and safeguard this square. So yeah, nice concept. I have seen it actually several times also played by black in the King's Indian. There is a similar idea where you do it on the king side. You play knight h5 and you let them take. You take g takes h5, and it's not so simple for white to make progress there. Time is money in these situations with opposite castled kings. So even if you lose that pawn in the end, maybe also the opponent took some time to take it, and in that case, the a-pawn, for example, in this case, it still needs some time to open up the game. While if you play the other way, if you play the other way, it's almost instant now. The opening of the a-file is almost instant. But if you play this move knight a4, even if they, by some miracle, were able to trade off the knight and put the queen and take, even then, that's what I'm trying to say, they will need quite some time to later on move away the queen and introduce the a-pawn into the attack. So definitely you win precious time by this move knight a4 idea, bringing the bishop to safeguard the queen side. So let's check our next example. We're back in the center now. We will look at the central blockade again. Sorry, in this example we can see how actually multiple pieces can take up the blockading tasks. We have with white pieces Dingliren, and playing black is Nihal. At this point you can see that white is playing for an attack. They played f5, but their whole setup, I would say, it's slightly dubious. Well, I definitely don't want to criticize Dingliren's play, but seems as if the weaknesses that are left behind on e5, for example, they are rather serious, and Nihal hurried to exploit these weaknesses. Since white is threatening bishop takes h6 and also threatening to play f6, we need to play something fast here. That's what he did in the game, g5 blocking. You can see that there is not a chance that this kind of sacrifice would work. They don't have enough pieces on the king side to attack us for now. The knight on e2 is not optimally placed. So g5, a very good move, because after queen f2, now as you can see, the time is right to block. So what do you think? Who should block on e5? Should we use the bishop or should we use the knight? In your opinion, which would be the best way to block the pawn? We could play both, but the big problem with knight e5 would be that we invite f6, and white will get like new hopes of attacking on the king side. So that's one reason why it's better to go with the bishop. The second reason is that if we go with the bishop, we can actually then also use the knight for a blockade. Both of them can block in this game. And that's what happened in the game. After the move rook de1, Ding is safeguarding the pawn on e4. Here actually Nihal played knight f6. And as you can see now, we have 2 pieces in the blockade. That's a very pretty blockade, very powerful, which it doesn't happen every day, so to speak. So this was a very useful plan by black. Please notice that if white tries to open up the kingside, we can also use our previous move, bishop e5, in a different way. We can exploit the square that the bishop freed on g7 to put our queen there. This looks very nice because we are safeguarding the kingside a little, and we also put some pressure on the long diagonal. So rook d1 was played in the game, and knight f6. As you can see, beautiful place for the knight, and it's almost impossible at this point. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it's very difficult for white to break through in this position. Black has a rock-solid formation here. Queen f3, queen g7. We talked about this kind of queen fianchetto. Knight d1. Ding is safeguarding the knight, but now time has come for active measures. Nihal knows that knight e3 and possibly knight g4 is coming up next. When your opponent carries out the blockade, one idea, apart from the fact that you can try to advance the pawn, the blocked pawn, in this case almost impossible, but the idea exists theoretically. But the other idea is to challenge the blocking piece. So in that case, if we bring the knight to g4, we could try to trade off one of these pieces, which will help white's case. Sorry. So, time for active counterplay. b5, we had a piece which we haven't talked about him at all in this example, but it's time to activate him. The bishop to go to a6, where it will target the pawn on c4. Very logical play by Nihal, because we couldn't do this last turn because the knight was on c3. So it's logical in a way. You look at the opponent's previous move and you try to find some flaw to it, and that's what happened here. b5, knight e3, and bishop a6. As you can see now, we have some pressure, so white's knight is kind of restricted to this defense. They don't really want to take. That would help us to take. I think we could take in both ways, but probably with the bishop, so that we have some extra vision here. And also we should not forget that maybe it's black who will ultimately play d5. That would be logical also. White is attacking on the king side, and we could strike back in the center, typical plan in this Maroczy structure. So anyway, bishop a6, white played here rook d1, trying to keep the position under control. B takes e4, knight takes e4, and here what Nihal doesn't want to allow is that white takes their golden bishop on e5, so he simply took on c4 instead. And here he actually started his own attack. He played here h5, followed up with g4. Black has a very safe game. You can say that they are probably the one enjoying the initiative at this point, and mainly it's thanks to these very nice blockading pieces on e5 and f6. Of course, the knight on c5 is also a great piece, but mainly the other 2 pieces are so useful because they avoid any chance for an attack by white. So nice concept by Nihal in this game. g5, white moves the queen somewhere, and then we install the bishop on e5, preparing to go knight f6 with some kind of, you could say, double blockade on e5 and f6. Let's check our next example with less pieces on the board. I wanted to show you that also in simpler positions we can use this idea of the blockade for defensive purposes. In this game between with white pieces Campora and playing black is Tisir, you can see that white is having a sound position. They have a passed pawn in the center and so on, but their king is slightly exposed because there aren't many pawns around the king, and you can easily see here that black has some ideas of exactly pushing the pawn, the unblocking move f3. They have some chances, some ideas connected to this move, trying to open up the game. If white takes, perhaps they could they could use a rook lift, something like that, and put more pressure. So what Campora did here, he avoided his plan. He found a smart way of blocking the pawn on f4. So which move do you think he played here? Again, we're talking backwards moves. I don't know why this happens so often in defensive play, but here we are again. That's right, bishop d1. The bishop will come to f3, where it will block the pawn, and at the same time, it will also keep an eye on the pawn on d5. So very nice move, bishop d1. f3 now, it's not really useful. Bishop takes doesn't really make sense for black because white keeps the g-file closed. They could play something like queen d6 instead. I think this was the best choice. Interestingly, here both sides after bishop f3, both sides will be blocking the opponent's pawn, you could say. White, they don't have a piece which can expel the queen from d6, so black's blockade will be fully working. One idea for black here would be to play rook e3, activating the rook, perhaps getting ready to play rook fe8, and we will have a tense battle here. Chances for both sides. In the game instead, after bishop d1, what black played was g5. And this is a little too, you could say, too optimistic, because now also black's king is exposed along the 7th rank. And that's what Campora exploited in the game. He played bishop f3. Now you can see that d6 might come up, tactical trick, hitting the queen and also hitting the bishop. So black played here bishop c8, avoiding that threat. And interestingly, here we have the unblocking move. Maybe this is what black didn't expect, that white will actually give up their passed pawn, but that's what they did. They gave it up, unblocked the pawn, so that now they get more freedom for their pieces. Queen takes d6 and rook takes g5. Simply because now black's king is in huge danger. Black played bishop f5, and it was possible to go and take this pawn on a7, but in the game, white preferred to go for more activity. They played here rook c6. You can see the rook is coming to h6 also. Queen d8 and rook h5. Not so simple to play this with black. You can see that white's king is perfectly safe. It can always go to h2. At the same time, black's having problems with the king. It's exposed. I would say not so much in this aspect, but rather on the long diagonal. That's the big problem, that they need to keep constant track of the long diagonal, and it's unpleasant when the opponent's pieces are like white's rooks here, close to black's camp, so to speak. It's not easy to defend such positions. They played bishop e4 in the game. White played rook c6, so that if bishop takes, there is rook takes h7. So this was a difficult position for black, and they were not really able to save this game. White later on went on to win. Yeah, by the way, there was a tactic here, as you noticed, of course. Not bishop takes, because white will have here queen. Black will have queen divided, queen takes h5. Of course, we don't fall into such cheap tactics. Much smarter to move rook c6, keeping the rooks protected and also attacking the pawn on h7. So simple example, yet rather useful. We bring the bishop to f3 in order to safeguard the pawn on d5 and prevent black's f-pawn from advancing. Our next example is also about the bishop, a typical idea which can be used especially in the Sicilian Najdorf, which appeared here in this game between Chara with white and Najdic with the black pieces. Chara has just played knight d5, typical move in these structures. What black does here is, first they take the knight. There is the threat against the black knight. Obviously we cannot take like that, it would leave our bishop trapped, so they take with the bishop instead. And here we arrive at our key move. So if we talk very briefly about this position, you could say that we have opposite castled kings again. Black would like to attack, of course, on the king side, in queen side in some way, maybe b4, a4, a5, and so on. Maybe install a knight on a4 or c4. Sorry, but they also know that white would like to attack themselves. Especially if we castle here, definitely white is going to consider something like h4 and g5 and open up the game, bring the queen to h2 and so on. They will do anything possible to open up black's king side. So that's what explains here Najdic's next move. Very typical and very useful. I have seen it several times in different versions. You got it. We can actually block this pawn, the h pawn. Aha, we have to use the bishop for that. Bishop h4. Very simple, very effective. After queen e2, now black castle without any issues. And one nice thing about this is that you can use the rook quickly in the counterattack. Now we get all the pieces to the attack. White's not even close to attacking themselves. And also if there is f4 at some point, we can maybe take and play rook e8 at some point. We couldn't really do this if our king was still in the center, if you see what I mean. So it's very pleasant for black to castle. That's an intriguing topic within the Sicilian, by the way, when to castle and when to keep the king in the center. Yeah, if you're interested in this topic, there is, for example, a game Polugajewski back in 1991, where Polugajewski castles exactly at the moment where you would think he wouldn't. But at that point, the king side was closed and he noticed that the king was very safe on the king side. So, interesting topic. It's usually better to castle short and long in the Sicilian. Don't castle long too often because the king gets exposed along the c-file. It's better to castle short, but okay, it's especially pleasant to do it when your opponent cannot play h4, as in this case. Let's check quickly what happened in the game. White played f4, trying to get some counterplay. Black installed this very nice knight on c4. You can see that now, since the pawn is not under attack, black is ready to go a5, a4, and continue with their attack. White played f5, keeping things closed. I think there were some tactical nuances, also some dangers perhaps on the e-file. But now it's very easy to play black here. Knight db6. The knight is trying to get to a4 at some point. They don't even bother to take the bishop because they know that their knights, they are so strong. Both knights will be very strong here. So actually it's white who is taking in the very end here. Bishop takes b6, avoiding knight a4. Black took back with the queen, and after queen e4, yeah, I was saying that this move looks like you're blocking queen e4, but it's actually not relevant in this position. Well, not so relevant because black is playing on the king side, queen side instead. Black is playing for the attack. So what white is trying to do here, I think they're just trying to bring out the bishop, basically. What black did here, they played a5 anyway, as we talked several times. When there are attacks with opposite castled kings, time is money. You can easily give away a pawn in order to help your attack. What knight has seen here is that if bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, simply a4, bring in the rook to b8. If white plays b3 at some point, maybe we can play a little on the a file also. We will have two channels, so to speak, for our attack, the b file and the a file. And we could toggle between these two according to white's play. So difficult case for white here. After a5, they played a3, and here simply rook fp8. Again, we don't have any issues giving up the knight. Yeah, this time they can definitely not take on c4. We take back, queen takes, and a4, as you can see. That would be dreadful for white. If they did that, you can see a4 is killing, because that is queen takes b2 in the end. So very difficult case for white. Black went on to win this game. You can see that unfortunately for white, they were never able to start their own attack, and that mainly had to do with the fact that black's bishop was holding up the h-pawn. So very nice concept by black. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and here the key move, I would say, of this example, not a new idea, but very useful. Bishop h4, we're blocking the pawn on the h-file. We don't let them advance. We keep our king perfectly safe. Later on, we are ready to castle short thanks to this. Let's check an example from a Ray Lopez structure. There it's also a common topic, this blockade, especially when you have this kind of structure. So white has just played f5 here in this game between Collins with white and David Howell playing black. What do you think we should do about that knight? Where to put that knight, the attacked knight on g6? Knight e5 is not what we want to play. In that case, knight takes, pawn takes, and white improves their pawn structure. They will have a passed pawn even if we can indeed block it. Black's game would be a bit passive here. So what Howell did in the game, he put the knight on f8. Again, another backwards move within defensive play. But what Howell has noticed is that this square on e5, that's something we can turn into a blockading square by means of knight e7, bishop f6, and ultimately knight e5. Interesting fact about this structure is that actually all black's pieces, even the king, you could imagine, could use this blockading square. Only the light square bishop couldn't do it, of course. But all the other pieces can actually pretend to use this square on e5 at some point. It's some kind of base of operations for black. Let's see what happened in the game. Bishop f4. In this way, white somehow complicates this plan, because at least when black is about to play bishop f6, first they will have to protect this pawn in some way. You can also see, by the way, that if white plays e5 at any moment, black would just take back and this pawn would be weak. I mean, if you played e5 here, for example, if you use this unblocking idea that we talked about, strategically it's a sound idea, but tactically it has this problem that the pawn is going to be weakness. If, I don't know, if white takes on e5, maybe we can just play like bishop f6. If they take, we take back, and in the end we can bring in the rook also, and this pawn will be a weakness. So not so easy for white here. Bishop f4 is what Collins played. There was knight e7, king h2, prophylaxis, and queen b6. We know this move. The point, of course, we protect the pawn so that we can go bishop f6. Next turn, b3, bishop f6, rook a2. White has managed to reinforce their queen side, but in the long run their game is difficult. If you look strictly at pawn majorities here, how are the pawns distributed, you would say that, okay, white's extra pawn in this one is this one, but it will be impossible to push that pawn, at least for now. While on the other side, black's extra pawn, so to speak, is the c-pawn. And that's much easier, of course, to push that pawn. We just need to prepare it a little. And that's what happened in the game. They played here rook ac8. They could have played knight e5 also, but it makes sense also to keep some flexibility. There is no rush to do this. I'm convinced that what Howell did here, he looked at white's play, he saw that there is no real threat at this point, so I don't have to commit with knight e5. I could wait a little. Maybe I can wait until they play something like g4. Maybe then I will play knight e5 or something like that. We can wait a little and see what what white does. In the meantime, it's nice to have this bishop open and so on. So he played here rook ac8, getting ready to push c4, I think, and after queen d2. Actually, he didn't play c4 because white could then block themselves. Pawn blockade like this. I have seen this in the Benoni. I have used this plan myself in the Benoni with white. Well, not exactly like this because black would have c3, but even so, it's an interesting plan because you limit the knight on d7 and you keep the queen side closed. Maybe you could even pretend to use the a file later on. An interesting plan. Bishop can come to e3, to d4, something like that. So actually, Howell pushed the other pawn instead. He played here b4. One motivation, of course, tactical, not to play bishop c3. But the other motivation is that he can go c4 and then he doesn't have to worry about this blocking move b4. So clever move b4. Queen f2 was played in the game and now a5. All right, question to you. Why do you think he played a5? What's the point of pushing that pawn? Not evident, right? It is rather evident. If you look at the well-being of black's minor pieces, we can see that the bishop on b7, it doesn't have a lot of scope right now. But in this way, we can bring it to a6 and then we can play c4. Basically, the only diagonal where we could activate this bishop in this structure. So, very clever idea, a5. After queen g3, now the pawn is under an attack. So finally, we have to play the move knight e5 that we could have indeed played a long time ago. But I like this way of thinking, flexible thinking. Now, after all, white paid the price for this also. They put the queen on g3 and perhaps it won't stay there forever. And bishop takes, knight takes, and evidently we take with the rook here so as to keep the blockade. What Howell noticed was that f6, it's not a big threat, we can just play g6, we always have queen d8, queen f8 in the pocket. Black is not so troubled here, white is missing the right pieces, you could say, to attack. They have actually ended up with the worst possible minor piece here, the bishop on c2. Bishop d3, black could have played bishop a6, but in the game, Howell played king h8 first, just in case whenever the queen comes to f4 or e3, trying to go to h6, we have already evacuated the square g8 for our rook. Rook c2, rook c8. You can see tactical tricks coming up with bishop takes d5. White played bishop e5 for that reason. Black moved away the rook. Now the pawn is a little more shaky on e4, so white went back. We don't want to repeat moves. We know that we are better in this position in the long run. White has a weakness on e4, and we have a very nice stronghold on e5. So Howell played here bishop c8. After rook ec1, queen b8. Wow, all the pieces are going backwards, but he has a plan here. He's going to play on the king side. Interestingly enough, it wasn't easy to bring about c4, so he's actually playing on the king side now. Queen f3, bishop d7, rook h1, and now the time is right. You got it. Now we start our own business on the king side. g5, we're going to bring the queen to h6 perhaps. The plan of pushing g4. White try to block themselves. That's the concept that we will look at later on in this chapter. And here, simply rook g6. As you can see, it's not like black is winning, but they have a nice initiative. The queen could come to f8 or perhaps to d8 to target the pawn on f6. And later on, we could even, at some point, consider something like h5 take and rook h6, try to open up the game. Safe to say black is ruling here, and later on, Howell went on to win. So a long example, but I think the main point here was to understand that when white played this move f5, they left a weakness on e5, which we should try to exploit. The right way of doing that is by playing knight f8. We will try to reroute the knight to e5 in the long run, and they will never have a chance to play e5. They can forget about an attack at our king. Okay, we saw a few examples with dark square structure for black. Let's switch the page here and look at something with white squares instead. The French, you got it. Let's have a look at the French example. This is, as you can see, some French win hour where white has the bishop pair. They're playing for an attack. You can see that there is a clear target on g7. White would like to take on g3 and attack that pawn. On g7, please don't forget that there are ideas like f5 and opening up the bishop as well. So what do you think? How can black possibly defend against this plan? That's true. It's the same case as in the previous example, that there is a protected square that it's very well used for a blockade, but we have to somehow figure out how to block. And we're talking about the square on f5, of course, this very nice square on f5. That's where we would like to block white. So what black played here in this game between with white pieces Hracek and black is Hausrat. Hausrat played here the move knight f5. That's not a difficult move to see, of course. What's difficult to see is the follow up, because after knight takes f5, we don't want to take with the pawn, of course. That would give white chances of pushing e6 at some point, and they could also use this square perhaps on g6. So we don't want to put the pawn there, we want to always put the piece there. So he took with the rook in the game, and here Racek played bishop d3. So we were saying that the queen and the rook are not optimal blockers, but in this case black actually used the rook as a blockader. So what were they thinking about? What was the point of all this? If they now have to move the rook again and they will let white play f5. Aha. If you know your Petrosyan, if you have seen Petrosyan's games, of course the next move is not a surprise to you. And I don't think that Hausrat needed many seconds to opt for the next move. It's also very pleasing to the eye, black's next move. Of course, knight e7. I think Ulf Andersson would also highly agree on this move. What we're doing here, we're sending the knight to f5. Nobody will be able to push away that knight, expel it from f5. It will be a giant, that knight on f5. We will see this soon, but the closed nature of the position will mean that white's rooks are actually not that powerful here. So very, very nice move, knight e7. If we don't understand this concept, yeah, definitely we run into huge difficulties here. You can see for yourself. f5. Would we play like that? Or maybe I'm getting too eager to attack here. Yeah, I think this could also be played, but even stronger I can see in my notes. If we play rook f7, white should first take, I think, on g3. We take first, and if now black insists, you can see that it's not even a threat, because white will then take. You can't take with the rook because you get mated, and if you take after knight f5 with the pawn instead, of course, you're inviting e6. So this would be bad for black. White could even exploit this circumstance before black brings another defender. White could play f5 themselves, unblocking the position here. So this would be a nightmare for black, and in the game they avoided this by giving up the exchange, a typical positional exchange sacrifice based on the blockade. So let's see what happened in the game. Yeah, bishop takes makes no sense, of course, because in that case we're even protecting the pawn. I don't know if we would actually take it. If they took on g3, that's another question. Would we take it or would we leave it? I guess we would take it, but you could also leave it and do your own stuff here, like d4 and bishop c6, queen d5. That's just one idea. You would have to check the tactics, of course, that is not bishop takes d4 or something. But maybe you could start with, I don't know, bishop c6, then play d4. Yeah, this looks fantastic for black. Anyway, let's see what happened in the game. White took on g3 in the game after the pretty move knight e7. They played rook takes g3. Black brought more pieces to the defense. Queen f8. Now the pawn is safely defended, and we get ready to put the queen here. The bishop could go that way, or perhaps the rook could also come to the defense. And at the same time, the pawn is hanging on f4. Maybe white should have played rook f1 here to protect the pawn. In that case, queen f7 makes sense, asking the question to white about the h-pawn. In the game, they took on f5, knight takes f5, and this was the dream position that black was hoping for. White played here rook d3, keeping the enemy knight at bay. Black played bishop e5. You can see who has the strongest bishop in this position. It's not difficult to figure out. Rook d2, queen f7, what black is doing here. They're slowly putting the pieces in the right places. The pawn is again under an attack, you could say, if bishop e8 comes. But we have other plans also. One of them is, of course, the plan that we talked about, d4 and bishop c6, and try to bring in the queen. So white played bishop d4 for that reason, blocking the pawn on d5. Black played bishop e8, and after bishop f2, yeah, what happened here? Aha, Hracek, he put a little trap here. You can see that if we take on h5, white will take, and what do you think white will play? That's right, now they will play on the queen side. That was white's idea. You can also see that if we speak strictly about king safety, I think we shouldn't trade queens here. I think black has the safer king in this position. I think white's king is more exposed, especially with this giant knight on f5. So the trade of queens, before you would always say it was favorable to black, but I think at this time of the battle, it's actually white who would like to trade queens, because somehow their king is a little uneasy here. Yeah, I'm telling you all the time about this plan. It didn't happen in the game, but we had it all the time like an option for black. So I think actually it's better for black to keep the queens. Another idea that you could consider is something like this: queen here and pile up against h5. So, any case, yeah, he played in the game actually queen d7. White played a4, and after bishop f7, they agreed to a draw. And I think that's what happened in Petrosyan's games also. Sometimes he would be exhausted after his clever exchange sacrifice, and he would accept a peaceful outcome. And maybe that happened in this game also. But I think Hausrat could have continued to play for a win here. One interesting plan here, according to what I was saying, queen e8, or even better, maybe king h7, rook g8, and g6. And we will see who has to say for king here in this kind of situation. I would say black's knight is fantastic both for defensive and aggressive purposes. Coming back to the initial position, knight f5, that's what was played in the game. That was not difficult to see, but after knight takes, rook takes, bishop d3, the key move that we had to understand here was that we can actually give away that rook. Clever positional exchange sacrifice, knight e7, fantastic concept by black in this game. They're ready to take back on f5. That will be the best possible knight you can get. It's blocking, it's on a protected square, and it's also covering a wide range of squares. All right, I think we saw many cases now of pieces taking up blockading tasks. It's time for the pawns to show what they are good for also. In our next example, Anand with white pieces and Erigaisi playing black. You will see how Anand uses a different kind of blockading thinking, you could say. That I'm convinced that you know about this idea already, but here we will look at it again. So let's see if we understand this. Black has just played knight takes h2. They sacrificed the knight on h2 in order to open up their attack. For their attack, the queen would like to come to the h file, and so on. You can see they have strong bishops directed at white's king. So evidently, whenever somebody sacks against you, first thing to check, can I accept? And Anand noticed that he can actually accept the sacrifice, but he must not touch the black pawn, the black h pawn. That pawn should be left as a shield for the king, the pawn shield. So that's what we're talking about here. Anand took on h2 because after h takes g3, he saw that this pawn, we can actually profit from it. It's not ours, but it will help us, because when we play king g2, we don't let their queen attack our king. So this is a very important concept, the pawn shield. That's what we will have a look at here in this and the next example. If you don't use this concept, if you play king takes g3, yeah, you can imagine what would happen, right? The hidden pin, you could call this queen g5, and it's game over. Now all black's pieces will attack in a decisive way here, or at least the queen and the bishops are there. So king g2, that's a clever, simple move played by Anand, and he's also ready to play rook h1 if necessary. This could be played if necessary, but it depends a great deal on black's next move. So if queen h4, evidently here we must play rook h1, and we prevent both threats, as you can say. You can see here. But on the other hand, if black plays which was the other variation? Queen e6. If you play queen e6, you can't do that anymore because rook h1 drops the bishop. But here, as you can see, Anand had f5 prepared to block the queen along this diagonal to obstruct the black queen. So for that reason, Erigaisi took the pawn on f4 instead. But this gains tempo for white, you could say. Now white starts counterplay. We talked about distraction in chapter 6, I think it was, or 7. When the opponent is attacking, we try to find some way of distracting their pieces. That's what Anand did here. Bishop c5, because now there is tension also on the d file, which is annoying for black. They're like missing one move in their development. They would have loved to have the bishop out so that they could take back with the rook, but that's not the case here. Black played in the game rook takes d1. As you can see, queen h4 wouldn't make sense anymore, right? We could just take on d8. I think we could also play this, but yeah, I would prefer to take first, and in this way we win an important time for our defense, and they would not have so much attacking chances anymore. Yeah, what would we play here? Yeah, I would even consider something like just rook h1 taking care of the h file, and who knows, maybe white's the one who could attack later on in this game. Anyway, in the game after bishop c5, what black played was rook takes d1 first, and this gives white a chance to turn the tables. It was possible to take back, but in the game Anand played bishop takes e7 for the sake of activity, because after rook takes a1, black has almost, I think, material balance, but queen takes e6 is just devastating. Black's pieces are not well coordinated. Rook e1 was played in the game. Counterattack. We don't even want to calculate queen takes a6, rook takes e2, the g-pawn is becoming a little dangerous, so Anand simply played bishop c4. Clever, flexible move. You can see that apart from this, there is also queen e8 coming up next. So this is promising for white, and they later on went on to win. So what we saw here, basically, we had to face this sacrifice, knight takes h2, take or decline. Well, on this occasion, if we can get away with it, of course, it's better to take. King takes, and after h takes d3, the king move here, king move, king g2. We leave the pawn on g3 as a shield for our king, like the umbrella pawn, they say also. In this way, we make it impossible for black to attack us in a good way. That was crucial detail in white's play, the pawn shield. Our next example is about the same thing. This time we're playing on the black side. It's another Sicilian. I hope you don't get bored by so many Sicilian battles, but I guess it's the kind of opening which leads to all these interesting defensive situations. Funny situation, what happened with that bishop on c3? Why is it hanging? Well, it turns out that black took on c3 at some point here, and white, instead of taking back, they just played the move f6. Very interesting idea on the topic of the non-recapture. They didn't take back on c3, they played f6 instead. It's easy to see their intentions. Of course, queen h6 coming up, mate on g7. There is another mating idea with rook h3 at some point, targeting h7 instead. So black should be very careful here. What they did in this game between Tigran Petrosyan, like a younger Tigran Petrosyan, and Vaibhav. What Vaibhav did here, he used the pawn shield. And I think when I was looking for different examples featuring the pawn shield, I soon noticed that this was perhaps the most common pawn shield. So that's why I wanted to include at least one example on it, because it's so common. It's when we use the opponent's h-pawn as a shield for our king. In the previous example, Anand used the g-pawn, but here we use the h-pawn. So this happens in many Sicilians. You can guess by now, black's next move, of course, no king h8. That would run into this classical trap. Queen h6, threatening mate, and rook g8. Aha, we have mate in 2 here. We don't let them play knight f8. We take on h7, and we duly mate them on the h file. So this is, of course, not what black played in the game. They played here. You got it. They played h5. The typical pawn shield, if things stay this way, it's difficult for white to make progress. They would need to bring a rook to h3 and play a bishop f3 and take, but it's going to be difficult because there are other parts of the board also, right? For example, if they start by, let's say, taking, we could put a knight on e5, I think. And for starters, if they put a rook here, whenever the bishop comes, we can just take it, but we can also pile up against this pawn. I mean, I'm not looking at this right now. I'm just thinking that we could play something like bishop e7 maybe, and we can counterattack this pawn if they, if they really insist with something like this to play bishop e2, bishop takes h5. It's very, very optimistic. We can attack this pawn in some way, or maybe play something like knight e4, and you see, we're attacking it again. Can put the knight there. So very unlikely that white's attack would pay off. In the game, after the clever move h5, Petrosyan instead played g takes h6, and here we see the idea. Of course, we should try to block the pawn as soon as possible. If we let them play h6, h7, there are just additional worries about maybe something like queen h6, some sacrifice maybe on f6, things like that, playing on the dark square. So king h7, of course, that's what we should play here. White took back on c3, and we know the move here, knight c e5. So basically the attack is over. What black will do now, they will start focusing on white's weaknesses. It's time for counterplay. After rook g3, I think there were actually another game played like this. Pavlidis, Ashwin. Ashwin played bishop b7 in this position. Interesting, you end up in some middle game position, you look up the database and there was another game in the same position, but that's simply because there are so many games nowadays. So bishop b7 was also possible with black, but in the game, Vaibhav found a more enterprising solution. He actually sacked the queen here. If you remember the example in the previous chapter, Lopez Martinez versus Rios, we had a similar situation where white was intending to sack, if you remember, queen takes b8 at some point. If you remember, they had a queen on d6, black played rook d5, and they were going to play queen takes b8. Here it's a similar situation. Black is ready to sack the queen for the sake of counterplay. After bishop c5, white was hoping to take this pawn on d6 to soften up black's dark squares, but queen takes a1, of course, very pretty concept. Knight takes a1, b takes e5, so that the rook can join. Nobody would like to be in white's shoes here. The attack has definitely backfired. Black has all the fun. You can see that soon they can bring in the other pieces also. What a fantastic knight on e5. Speaking about the blockade, what a great blocking knight on e5. White's bishop on g2 is also not very effective. They would have preferred to have, let's say, knight on h3. So nice, you could say, metamorphosis of this position. Black was defending, but now suddenly they are attacking. For starters, rook b1 is about to come. So nice play here by black, h5. If g takes h6, we have king h7. That's the pawn shield that we're talking about. White cannot really progress here in their attack. This is a good idea to know about, especially if you play the Sicilian with the black pieces. Okay, so let's continue. Let's see another blocking idea, similar idea, some kind of pawn shield, or maybe not. I'm not sure how I should classify this next example. I can just tell you that it's an interesting and very useful idea in this game between Das with the white pieces and Sethuraman with the black pieces. So Das has just played h5. You can see again another position with opposite castle's king. We get this all the time. h5, they're trying to open up the h-file. We don't want to take, of course. Then they would take with the rook and they would get chances for an attack. You can imagine e5 coming up and queen takes h7. Many things can happen here. And we don't want them to take either because it would be basically the same thing. So how do you think we could possibly keep things closed here? That's right, we can happily give away a pawn for that purpose. Sethuraman played g5. Very pretty concept, because if you look carefully, you can see that if white takes on g5 at this point, well, in that case, we also get a juicy square for our knight on e5, like a blocking square, and they can safely forget about this move, e5, for the near future. So that would happen if they took. In the game, white first played h6. It would be natural to play here bishop h8, you would say, but in that case, actually, white has an unexpected move. What do you think they would play instead of taking the pawn on g5? Is there any smarter way of attacking, maybe? Good point. They can actually bring in the rook here, rook h5, trying to take with the rook. So this would create additional problems for black. For that reason, in the game, Sethuraman played bishop f6 instead, so that he can keep control of the square. The bishop could come here later on. Again, backwards moves as always. White took on g5. Yeah, the threat of rook h5 was not that dangerous anymore, because we won't let them take with the rook anyway on g5. That's why our bishop was there. I mean, if you play rook h5, you could play pawn takes and they don't get there. That's what I'm trying to say. So after bishop f6, f takes g5, bishop d8, you can see that now it's black's time to attack. They basically have everything under control. They would like to play knight e5, and later on try to target these pawns on, yeah, all these three pawns could be attacked here, right, at some point. So after knight g3, we had the unblocking sacrifice, by the way, g6, but black could just take it probably, and yeah, they don't need to take the next pawn. If you play something like knight f4, maybe you wouldn't take the pawn, right? It would expose yourself. Or maybe even you could not take. Oh, I think I looked at this. Yeah, actually, I didn't take with the queen. Interesting. I actually took with the pawn to play king h8. All right, this might be even safer. Again, you can see we're happy that white has a pawn on h7, else we would be in big trouble here. But it's nice that the pawn is actually blocking our king. So yeah, another case, you could say, of the famous pawn shield. No, it's not able to advance thanks to our king being on h8. So knight g3 was played in the game. Knight e5, black starts the counterattack. King b1, safeguarding the bishop. I think it's what they would like to do here, because they know that black will take this pawn or that pawn. In the game, they prefer to take on c4. I can perfectly understand that, because that makes our attack easier. Now we can run with the pawn, and also we're actually happy that they have these double pawns. It's just obstructing their attack in the context of pawn shield, you could say, or connected to this idea. Bishop c1, knight e5, the knight goes back, so that we are ready to push the pawn. I think we could also play b5 at once if you like. Anyway, knight h5, b5, and black was much faster on their side. You can see already we have this idea of b4, b3. White can probably forget about using a pawn shield themselves, because if later on b takes king 1, you can see that knight b3 will come also. So black has a very nice advantage here at this point, and they later on went on to win. So not a difficult example, I would say. We should just be a little anti-materialistic. As I said in the very introduction to this course, it's good to be a little anti-materialistic when you're defending. It can be enough. I mean, it can be worth it to give up a pawn to reduce the opponent's attack. That's what Sethuraman did here, g5, so that if white takes, their attack is a bit hampered. They don't manage to open up the h-file, which was their original plan. Let's see another example, again based on blocking with our pawns, but in a more, you could say, more quiet way. In this game between Christiansen with white and Jesse Cry with the black pieces, you can see that we have opposite castle kings. Black would love to attack on the queenside, also with the other pawn perhaps. So what Christiansen did here, he used a very well-known method. It's known ever since the game, well, perhaps earlier also. Spassky, Petrosyan, back in their world champion match. I think I used that example in Mastering Chess Strategy, where Spassky was attacking on the queen side and Petrosyan suddenly played the move a6. This is the same thing. Here, Christiansen played a3. Why did he play this? Well, there is an important idea behind this move. If black later on plays b5 and a4, white will close the doors with b4. And if black instead plays b4, we will close them with a4. Okay, we will see this a little sooner, but that's what Christiansen did in the first place. Now a4, b4, and there is no a3 anymore. Any other move that you play here, if you play something like, yeah, what would you play here? Queen e3, perhaps, to play rook g1 and g4, a4, b4, a3, without thinking, no? And black will have new chances on the queen side. So very clever, simple move a3. In the game, black played rook a6, queen e3. We're trying to attack on the king side by means of rook, I don't know, maybe this rook and g4. b5 was playing in the game, knight f3. And here you have the situation. Let's play one more move. Bishop d7 was played in the game, safeguarding the pawn, and rook g1. So white is ready to attack now, as you can see. And this is the moment that I wanted to highlight, that at this point, black's unfortunately not able to break through on the queen side, because if they play a4, as you can see, we would then play b4. If they play b4, we would play a4. So in both cases, it would be very difficult for black to break through thanks to these very clever pawns. This is a nice method that you can use in different openings. I have seen it in all kinds of openings, this kind of pawn blockade. And this is exactly what Petrosyan did with the black pieces versus Spassky. That's a famous game I think in the Torre attack with white, and Petrosyan castled long, and Spassky was attacking him with the pawns, but Petrosyan arranged the pawns exactly in this way. Okay, let's see the game. b4, a4. The sacrifices aren't really working on a4. It takes a long time, and you can see that also white is about to attack themselves. Knight e4, interesting defense by Cry. You can see that if d takes, f takes, we have double threats against these two knights. So what white played in the game, they just ignore this. Christiansen played his attack instead with g4. Bishop c5. Black is trying to muddy the waters a little here. If d4, they would like to take on g4. I think there was some tactic. Yeah, some tactic here. Rook takes h5, something with attacking these two knights on f4 and f3. So after bishop c5, bishop d4, much safer. We get rid of that passive bishop, you could say, although it was a defending bishop also. Bishop takes, knight takes c5. Black goes all in, knight b5. That knight would like to go to d6, maybe some glorious day. And here black took on g4. I checked this a little. d4 was more promising for black, but okay, very complex variation. If you would like to see a funny variation, check out this one. Queen f3, bishop c6. You can see again, if pawn takes, there is pawn takes, and the knight is again hanging. So white will play here g5, blocking the game completely. Why do they do that? Well, after knight c3, black is trying to unblock the queen side, but white could play now the move g6. Yeah, that's crazy. No, the queen is hanging, but we attack white's queen, black's queen instead. What's the point of this? Well, if they play f takes, we can go queen h3. We give up the exchange, and then we play for an attack here, I think, with queen h1, and we have like knight takes t6 coming up and so on. And very nice diagonal for the queen. If instead, this strange variation, black plays queen takes d6, we could play the same way, queen h3. Their queen is in the air, and we sack the exchange here. Rook g5, bishop takes, queen takes. The computer was not completely convinced about this, but I think the more it looked at it, the more it liked it also. White is the exchange and the pawn down, but it's difficult for black to get that white. And they have some chances here also. This pawn is weak, and the knight is very strong on f5, like Hausstradt's knight when he sacked the exchange in that French game, if you remember. It's a very powerful knight. So who knows? Close position, sometimes knights can be stronger than rooks. That's something that Petrosyan showed in his game. So perhaps if this crazy variation occurred, actually white would have their fair of the chances here. In any case, in the game, black took instead of g4. Rook takes, and now white has a ready-made attack here, h5. In the end, they give up the knight, but they take it back next turn. Queen takes, rook g1, you can see g7 is hanging, so black must give back the knight. Rook f7, we take on e4, queen takes e5. Yeah, we shouldn't run into queen a1, of course, so king b1. White has all the play here. They have the attack. You can see that their queen side is very safe. It was very difficult for black to break through it. White is the one who is attacking, so interesting concept. I'm sure you have seen it before, and here you saw it once more, how we can put two pawns on the same rank, so that if the opponent's pawns advance, we will push the other pawn, right, like that. You have it here after a3, rook a6, queen e3, b5, knight f3, bishop d7, rook dg1. That's the situation that I wanted to highlight. Here you have it. Now we have arranged our pawn in that way so that we're ready to push the other pawn. It won't work in all pawn structures, of course, depending on which pawns are on the board, but here it works out very well. Okay, last example, to have a look at a simple pawn blockade, you could say, when one pawn stops another pawn from advancing. You have this topic also in pawn endings, for example, but here I wanted to show you an opening position or early middle game in this game between Giri with white pieces and Artemiev playing black. Artemiev just played f5, not a typical plan in this IQP structure, but here it's rather logical because there is a hook on f4 and black has all their pieces on the king side. So safe to say it's a logical plan for them to go for white's king here. So what do you think? How could we make life a little safer for our king? Could we block the pawn on f5? Could we put something on f4? Well, probably not. There is no knight, for example, or bishop close to this square. What else could we do? f3, that would be very optimistic. You can see the queen is hitting g3, so it would be a present to black now. Knight takes, bishop takes, and queen takes g3. So what Giri played in the game, f4, that's the kind of blockade I was talking about. It's not that common, but it's good to know it, of course. Like a full-scale blockade, like in some endgames when you want to block the position confidently. Now it's very difficult for black to break through on the king side. Artemiev tried here. Knight c4. Yeah, by the way, if they give check, the safest reply would be queen d4. We're happy to trade queens for multiple reasons. One, we're attacked. Two, black is having the IQP. In the game, after f4, there was knight c4. Of course, if bishop takes c4, the queen is hanging, so white needs to do something about that. And there is also something with the invasion coming on e3. So white took on g4, f takes d4. The pawn structure changed a little, but still it's the same picture. Thanks to this pawn on f4, it's difficult for black to break through. Queen c2, so that we bring in the rook, and also we get ready to meet queen b6 with queen f2, I think. Queen b6, oh, actually not. No, queen f2 is bad probably because of course, we give up this pawn, right? They can take this pawn. But what white can play is knight d4, and later on, I think, bring the queen to f2. If black takes the pawn this time, it's not the same thing. We can take and then take on e8, I think. Pawn tension, if you're rook tension, we talked about that before. Sometimes it's the right moment to give up the control of the open file, because white wants to play rook a b1 without being annoyed by black taking on e1. And now, as you can see, they will take back and they will have counterplay with knight f5 and so on. So that would happen in the case black takes the pawn in the game. No, actually, this didn't happen. Sorry, he could have played it. I think this was a rapid game, so he didn't have so much time, Giri, on the clock. He played safer in the game, king h2. And here, rook e3 is what Artemiev played. Looks a little scary, but white is actually okay here. In the game, they played queen g2, and here there was a fancy tactic. I think rook takes f4, something with rook h3 coming up next. Yeah, this should be avoided, but they played something else in the game. Rook takes e3 is as simple as that. After black takes back, with the queen probably. If they take with the knight, we could just put the queen here perhaps, tying the knight to the pawn. Queen takes e3. I think now we can simply put the queen on g2. We're targeting this pawn, and we get ready to play something like rook d1 next turn. You can see that clearly here the benefits of this move f4. This is not a semi-open f-file anymore for black. I mean, it is, but it's not useful for them because we have the pawn there. So a rather simple method, I would say. Nothing really spectacular, but very useful. They want to play f4. We prevent it. On this occasion, there was no minor piece ready to take up the blockading task. We will have to rely on the pawns. So for that reason here, best move f4. Weakens a little the position, the e4 square and so on, and the g4 square. But most important here is that we don't want to let them play f4 in this position. So some kind of full-scale blockade that's useful to know about. Okay, many examples. We are done. We have seen so many ideas about the blockade. Let's do the quick recap. We start with the Sicilian example, one of the Sicilian examples, knight d7 to knight e5, limiting the bishop on d4 and making it impossible for white to play e5. We saw a similar idea on the king side. Petrosyan played knight h7, preventing the move g5 and preparing to play at some point knight g5, although it's true that g5 is not clean blockading square because white has f4, but it's somehow connected to this kind of thinking. We saw Paco Vallejo put the knight on a4, not being worried about black taking on a4. He would actually take with the pawn. Later on, cement his pawn structure by means of bishop c4, bishop b3. Very clever construction. Nihal's idea with bishop e5 and knight f6, some kind of double blockade. Both minor pieces take up blockading tasks with a very nice control of the position. We saw how Campora brought the bishop to f3 to prevent black's f3. Sometimes we can use the bishop also for blockading purposes. The same thing happened with black in this example. The bishop went to h4 so as to avoid white's h4. A little similar to the topic of the obstruction that we saw in chapter 6, I think, when we can put a piece on the h-file, for example. But in that chapter, we were obstructing their pieces, but here we're obstructing their pawns. That's what I'm referring to with the blockade. We saw Howell taking care of the square on e5, exploiting the weak square on e5 by rerouting the minor pieces in a smart way to finally put the piece on e5. Interestingly, almost all black's pieces could use this square on e5, like a base of operations for black's pieces. In the next example, Hausrat gave away the exchange in a very pretty fashion. In this French example, they had a very strong knight on f5, which fully compensated for the minus exchange. A clever way to hold up white's f-pawn. We saw how Anand used the pawn shield by ignoring the pawn on g3, putting the king on g2, exploiting the fact that this pawn actually, it obstructs black's own attack. And the similar case was our next example where black played h5, g takes h6, king h7, typical Sicilian scenario. We're using the pawn shield, the pawn umbrella, you could say, on h6 to shield our king. We saw how Sethuraman gave up a pawn in order to avoid the opening of the h-file, and in this way frustrate white's supposed attack on the king side, and then he was ready to attack himself on the queen side. The loss of a pawn was not so important in this context. Christiansen used this classical, you would say, another Petrosian legacy, put the pawns on a3 and b3 so that we're ready to block. If they advanced one pawn, we push the other one, and we keep everything closed. And finally, Giri played f4, blocking black's f-pawn so that they would not be able to open up the f-file. Slightly weakening, but for the sake of king safety, everything is allowed. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.